Okay. Well, thank you all for having me today. Glad we got the tech issues sorted out here a little bit. Um, I'm going to talk about some basically random thoughts that occurred to me of what we really need to do to try to get high performing teams in the 21st century. And the title today is The Missing Ingredient, whatever that might be. So let's take a look at it. Of course, I have to start off with a quote from Charles Darwin, because why not? And this is interesting, I find, because this is one of the longer versions of this quote that you see flying around the net. It says, "It's not the strongest of the species that survives or the most intelligent. It's the one that is most adaptable to change, that lives within the means available and works cooperatively against common threats." We don't usually see the back end of that quote. It's usually just the first part about the most adaptable being the best to survive. But I find the rest of that quote as interesting, if not even more interesting. We have to be able to adapt to change within the resources we have available to us and working cooperatively against common threats. So, way back when, at the turn of the century, a bunch of us got together in Snowbird, Utah, to try to figure out better ways of developing software. And again, if you haven't been to agilemanifesto.org, it's an interesting read. I recommend it. That's, you can see on the picture there, it's the back of my head, my name there listed in the middle. And one of the best parts of the manifesto, again, I don't think people really pay much attention to, but the very first sentence says, "We are uncovering better ways of developing software by doing it and helping others do it." It doesn't say we have found the perfect way to develop software. It doesn't say these are the 10 commandments engraved in stone and you thou shalt do it this way. It says we're uncovering better ways, discovering, finding out what works. And listed some things that seemed important to us at the time, that individuals and interactions are more important. Working software is important. Collaborating with the customer is important. Responding to change, maybe the most important thing. Um, and of course, unfortunately, when a lot of companies, a lot of teams want to try to become agile or become more agile, they kind of get stuck on the very first item there. It's all about individuals and interactions. It doesn't matter the process, it doesn't matter the tooling. That's irrelevant. It's all about people and their interactions. So there was an interesting bit going around a while back. This analyst, Gary Hamel, noted what would constitute a sort of 19th century version of a business operating system. Kind of horse and buggy days. Everything's very linear. Strategy gets set at the top of the organization, and power, such as it is, trickles down. Big leaders appoint little leaders. You have to compete for promotion. Your compensation, how much you get paid, correlates with your rank, not what you do or how valuable you are. Tasks are assigned to you. This one drives me crazy. I see so many teams that say that they're agile, they're trying to be agile, and they get assigned what to do. It doesn't work that way. The managers would assess your performance. Rules tightly govern what you can do, what you're allowed to do, and what you're not allowed to do. So you don't have a lot of latitude in a 19th century style organization. And so, what we've been pitching for the last 20 years is trying to get away from that linear mindset and realize that we're actually working in complex adaptive systems. They're nonlinear. Cause doesn't always follow effect. The world as it exists here in the first quarter of the 21st century, it's volatile, it's complex, it's uncertain, it's ambiguous. So, what do we try to do to get around that? Well, we want to work in very small batches with small, stable teams, not with team members coming and going and not being available and pulled off to other projects. We want very short cycles so that we can get fast feedback from users. We want to consider that the organization is more like an organic living network of high performing teams, and that the leaders at all levels, whether it's a team lead through executive leadership, are more like gardeners and influencers. They're not the ones with all the answers, but they're the ones that are, nudging and steering. So that sounds interesting, different maybe. Um, so, what is Agile not? People get a lot of misconceptions about Agile. And I've had people tell me, and I've said this in tons of interviews, I've had a lot of people tell me with a straight face that they're Agile because they do Scrum and they use Jira. And no, that's not it at all. So, Agile is not pull requests. Seriously, just stop. Pull requests are the wrong tool for the job. They're designed for a low trust environment with a lot of contributors. We're talking about a corporate development team where there should be high trust and a small number of contributors. It's the wrong tool for the job. Stop using it. Scrum. Y'all ain't going to like this. And I'm going to go out on a limb here. Stop doing Scrum. If you really want to be high performing, Scrum will hold you back. Scrum is, at best, training wheels to get an organization from doing very long cycle waterfall style developments that are 6, 12 months out into a 2 week waterfall. And that's great. I mean, don't get me wrong, there's absolutely a place for that. It's a good starting place. It's a lousy finishing place. Start there but move on. All the other good bits, extreme programming, lean ideas, DevOps, even Jira, none of that is, quote, agile. They have their uses, they have their tools, there's some good parts there, but it's not what agility is. So, okay, Andy, what is agility? Well, one of the things we kind of collectively screwed up when we did the Agile Manifesto was we didn't really define it. And that was somewhat, I think, on purpose at the time. We didn't want to, nobody really wanted to tie us down to something concrete like that. So a couple of years later, when I was writing the book, Practices of an Agile Developer with my good friend Venkat Subramaniam, we decided, okay, we need a definition to work with here. What is agility? So we came up with this, that Agile development uses feedback to make constant adjustments in a highly collaborative environment. That's what it's all about. There's no Scrum in there. There's no tickets. There's no Jira. There's no Git push. There's no PRs. There's none of that nonsense. It's fast feedback and use the feedback to make adjustments in a highly collaborative environment. So, interesting real world example of that outside of software. This fellow in the Netherlands, Hans Munderman, I believe, invented a kind of a traffic plan that has no signs, no lanes, nothing to kind of guide you. And as a result, as you navigate this as a pedestrian or in your motor vehicle, you can't just go on autopilot and sail through the intersection. You actually have to be aware. You have to have situational awareness. You have to think. You have to sort of negotiate. And as a result, at least when this was first implemented, accidents dropped 90%. Interesting. You'd think it'd be the other way around. We don't want anything to be a big deal, a big episode, right? Even having like a long running feature branch that you've run for weeks and weeks and then have to integrate back into main. No, that's not agile, and it's very dangerous. You can run into the same kind of problems you run into trying to do integration at the end of a several week project or a several month project. We want small, continuous work, right? Start off with evaluating what feedback you have. This idea of requirements analysis, I've never liked the term. It's discovery. It's a dialogue. It's shared learning. What should this do now? Okay, we have an idea about that. We'll make some kind of a to-do list, backlog if you like, whatever you want to call it. And then you get to the part that should be mechanical. Continuous integration, continuous deployment, continuous monitoring, right? That should be a no-brainer. You check it in, it does its thing, boom, and now you've got feedback, whether it's from unit tests, integration system tests, talking to users, marketplace acceptance, whatever it might be. You've got some feedback. You're going to learn from that. You're going to make some small changes and go around the circle. as fast as you can. The faster you go around the circle, the faster you win. Feedback prevents fantasy. So back before the moon landing or satellites or even decent telescopes, right, we had all kinds of very fanciful ideas of what was on the moon. Little green men, civilizations living under the moon with captive slave girls. I mean, it was the 1800s, whatever. All kinds of crazy ideas because we didn't know. There was no feedback. So that's kind of the limit case. When you're approaching something and you have literally no idea what's out there, you're bound to invent things that are just, crazy off the rails. So one of the techniques that Dave Thomas and I really tried to push back in the Pragmatic Programmer book, also around the turn of the century, 99, we were working on that. We had this idea that developing software should be like tracer bullets. Now, if you don't know, um, tracer bullets, you take a machine gun or something, and every so often in the ammo, you put a round that lights up. So the idea is that as you're firing the weapon, you get a tracer through the sky and you can see exactly where the ordnance is landing. So if you're moving, the target's moving, there's wind, whatever the environmental conditions are, it doesn't really matter because you're getting real-time feedback of seeing what target you're hitting. So the target moves, you move. You move, you adjust your aim. You can adjust in real time under real world conditions. And that's exactly the kind of environment we want to try to develop with software. So another way of looking at that, when they build suspension bridges, Golden Gate's a good example. You start with the very simplest thing: one cable anchored on each end. Hello world, right? No more than hello world, but it goes end to end from database through, web server and to the client, whatever the bits and pieces are. It goes all the way end to end. It can't, you can't drive cars over it yet, right? It's hello world. It's one cable, but you use that to flesh it out, to build more very, slowly, one piece at a time. You build out, and then you're done. Everything's shiny. You've got a nice bridge. And this is what I find interesting because, literature and folks have talked about iterative and incremental development for decades now, and folks still get it wrong. Um, Folks will spend a lot of effort trying to get it right the first time. You can't, there's no feedback. You want to aim for getting it right the last time. Good designs, good code requires multiple attempts. That's not a sign of failure. It's not a sign that we're not smart enough. It's a sign that we didn't have enough feedback because there's no feedback at first, right? So you have to do something, get feedback, adjust your approach, adjust it, repeat as necessary. It takes multiple attempts. You're not going to get it in one shot. Not well. So we want feedback in all the things. Quick feedback has to be part of the whole environment, not just in code on the team, but in the rest of the organization, interfacing to other parts of the organization. We want real feedback under real conditions. And the funny thing is that in other parts of most organizations, um, folks are used to that. Advertising, right? You never know what ad is going to spark the imagination of the public, what they're going to use, what's going to make them buy something and what's not. So what do? They do A/B tests, with newsletters, with email campaigns, with ad campaigns. UX UI is all about studying, people's reactions. Does this work better? Is this better? And measuring it and tweaking from there. That's how we answer questions. And yet, for some reason, we're still reticent to sort of do that in software. We come up with one idea, one design for a piece of code, and hey, slam, we just do it. Well, come up with three alternatives. See which one works better, which one's easier code, which one's going to be easier for you to maintain. You know, Try a couple different approaches, get the feedback. Another misconception is that development happens in phases, that there is a distinct design phase, testing, integration, release, lawsuit, reorganization, right? Um, yes, these happen, but it doesn't happen in these sort of phases, right? You want to have the continuous approach where you're doing a little bit of everything all the time, and none of it is a particularly big deal. Um, again, a lot of folks I think have the mindset that there's a GUI layer and a server layer and a database layer. You might even have separate teams in larger organizations working in this sort of layered approach. When instead you want to look at thin vertical slices. Again, going back to the idea of tracer bullets, where you start off with a very, very simple thin thread that goes end to end and does, it doesn't even do login, but it's like the place where login would be. And then you expand on it and you flush it out end to end, because then once you've got some sort of MVP level of functionality, you have something that actually works. You're not then beholden to trying to integrate that with some other chunk and have a handoff, right? Handoffs you don't ever want. That's part of the problem with pull requests is, in lean ideas, any kind of handoff is a waste, and you want to try to eliminate that. So one thing to think of is if you can't finish the task that you're trying to do, the story you're working on, the feature, what have you, if you can't finish it in one day, then it's too big. You should chop that up into smaller pieces. And I love this quote. I actually just found this today. It says, "Don't bite off more than you can chew because nobody looks attractive spitting it back out again." Yeah. And unfortunately, we are very prone to this as developers because it's easy to sort of visualize it in your mind and be like, oh, yes, I know exactly how this is going to work. And then kind of dive in with the whole thing in front of you. And it's doesn't work well that way. So the one weird old tip to be a better developer, take smaller steps, comically small steps. Hello world, test it, check it. Add the next little tiny thing, test it, check it. That's how you succeed. Um, and in this kind of environment, the schedule will iterate because the speed of the team is more or less a constant, unless you change team members or something. But with this team on this project, this is how fast they're going to go. And that may or may not match any deadlines that you want, but the speed is the speed. Um, what you have to also think of is the team has more to do than just develop features. It's not a feature factory. There's actually three different tracks that you need to concentrate on: refine, discover, and deliver. So deliver, of course, that's the obvious part that we always see, producing the next shippable slice of functionality. But you need time on the schedule, on your backlog, on your to-do list, on your Jira tickets, whatever it is. You need time to discover, to experiment with the next tech stack that you want to use, alternative design options. Well, we did it this way. What would happen if we did it this other way? What kind of innovation can we get in there? And time to actually fine tune and improve the development process, right? Agile Manifesto says, and Scrum echoes, that the team should reflect and refine their approach. Hey, let's actually do that. And here's the pro tip: if it's not on the schedule, it's not going to happen. So if you actually put it, you actually schedule time for these activities and make it part of what the team does and what the team's responsible for, it might actually happen. And again, you're not going to get it right the first time. It takes iterations. It takes trying something, getting the feedback, doing an experiment. There's this new practice that we'd like to try as a team. Great. It probably won't work well at first for a variety of reasons, but you're going to give it a try. And from the feedback, say, okay, well, I think this would work. We need more training on it, or we need more time with it, or this is a good idea, but I think we need to change this a little bit because of our organization. That's fine. Do exactly that. Try it, change it, tweak, and keep going. The big problem is that as people, we are really, really reluctant to with change. We don't like change. There's a saying that only wet babies like change. Even they cry through it. They don't really like to be changed either. And even when we come up with something that's obviously a better idea, it doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be adopted. And I love this particular quote where this physician says, talking about a new technology, says that it will ever come into general use is extremely doubtful. It requires much time and gives a good bit of trouble both to the patient and the practitioner. It is foreign and opposed to all of our habits and associations. And you know what that physician was talking about? The stethoscope, which is kind of interesting because that has become so ubiquitous and so common. It's practically the icon for physicians. And yet, when it was first introduced, it was strange. It was different. People didn't really, groove on it. Um, and that's kind of the problem we find ourselves facing. If we use the same old methods, we're going to have the same old outcomes. And that's sort of what we've been doing for the 20 years since the manifesto's been out. There have been a lot of organizations, a lot of groups who have understood the idea, understood the principles, and they have created high performing teams and high performing organizations to take advantage of that. And then there's a lot of folks who just aren't willing to really try a different outlook, a different mental model, a different approach. And so they fall back on the same old methods and unfortunately get the same old outcomes. So, what is the missing ingredient? Well, I hope you saw it today. Anything that I talked about, any idea that I floated out there, if you're not doing or you're not comfortable with, that's the missing ingredient. And you should look into that and research it and say, well, maybe we should be using feature branches. Maybe we should not be using whatever. Um, and if everything, made perfect sense and you're like, yes, Andy, we do all that, we're on board, awesome. That's actually what I would love to hear. I would love to give talks where I go over, a lot of these ideas, a lot of these basics, and everyone in the audience says, yes, we're there, we're on it. That hasn't happened yet, but I keep hoping. I hope to be irrelevant someday. So that's really all I had to talk about today. Here are some of the books that I've written. I've kind of lost track. I'm up around 12, 13, 14 books, somewhere in there, starting with the original Pragmatic Programmer back around the turn of the century. The new 20th anniversary edition just came out with new tips, new tricks. Highly recommend it. The Practices of an Agile Developer book is older. It's a little dated now, but still has some gems in there. Pragmatic Thinking and Learning, Refactor Your Wetware, all about techniques to learn better on the job. Because let's face it, the two things that programmers really do day in and day out is communication and learning. And we're not really trained specifically on either of those. So the Pragmatic Thinking and Learning book tries to step in and help us um, find tricks and ways to learn better, organize knowledge better, and be more effective with it. More recently, I've started writing fiction. I've got some space novels there in the Conglomerate series. And I just recently am putting the finishing touches on a futuristic haunted house horror book that is has drones. So you've got ghosts and drones. It's kind of cool. And if you like electronic music, I've got a lovely minimalist. I hate to call it ambient, but sort of a minimalist exploration of textures in Wormhole Waiting Room, which is fun. You can find me on Twitter at Pragmatic Andy. My homepage is at toolshed.com. If you're interested in a lot of these methodological software issues, growsmethod.com is the place to go. And of course, the publishing company at pragprog.com with all these lovely titles. Thank you all so much for having me today. Do we have time for questions? I see Leo talking, but you can't hear him.
Léo, você tá mudo, cara. Tá no mute. Volta do mute.
Thank you, Andy.
Boa.
I love electronic music. I'm a producer too.
Okay.
Thank
Can you
you.
hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Mr. Hunt, thank you very much for your time and all the experience present over the years, including today. Okay. You mentioned that you don't need to get right the first time, right? This is very important. Some company here, don't understand this point. You know, they looking for a right thing and right moment. I can wait for this. You know, they don't understand. Oh, okay, you can make mistakes now, but tomorrow you can fix it and try again and try again.
Well,
You
what I
know,
find interesting is, it really depends on what you envision a software project to be, right? If somebody thinks that it's like building construction where you've got blueprints and you build it, then they're disappointed that you keep reworking it. But if you think of it like a Hollywood script, a movie script, right? They rewrite those as they're going all the time. The author wrote something, they're filming it, and they realize that doesn't work, and they have to change it. And they will change dialogue and make last minute changes, right up to the very end as they're building the film. So in that industry, that's very common and it's expected, and that's the way it goes. And for some reason, we just don't have that expectation with software. People assume you just sit down, type a little bit, and you're good to go. And it's not that easy.
Cara, você tá no mudo, cara.
Peraí, eu não tô
More,
conseguindo mexer aqui. Peraí.
more questions? Tá mudo, tá travado.
Você tá me ouvindo? Alô?
I see a question in the chat. Yeah, there we go. When did we get lost fighting between methodologies instead of trying to learn how to work together? That's a very good question. I wish I'd paid better attention to find out when that kind of started happening. Um, but part of it is there's a very natural tendency that when you've got a published methodology with a list of practices, a list of steps, that people will spend all their effort making sure they do the process exactly as written, and that adherence to process is very important. And the problem is that's true in some environments. If you're trying to minimize variance, you're on a production line, for example, then yes, you want adherence to process, you want to minimize variance, you want to be very strict, yada, yada. But that's not true with knowledge work. In our case, where you want creativity, you want innovation, you want these sorts of things, you actually want the exact opposite of that. You want variance. You want as much variant as possible to come up with interesting alternatives, and that's where discoveries get made. So, a lot of what is problematic with agile in organizations really comes down to issues of human nature, and that's what makes it particularly difficult to try to get around. One of our cognitive biases is a need for closure, right? How long is this going to take you to build it? Well, I don't know. We haven't built it yet. I mean, that's the right answer. But it's like, well, I need a number. There's a spreadsheet, there's a cell. I have to type in a number. Give me a number. 42. Okay, great. I feel better. I have closure. I've satisfied my psychological need for closure, even though I know that that number is completely fictitious, and I just made it up. Like the Dilbert cartoon says, 85% of all statistics are made up. Um, but it's driven by this psychological need, and that's a hard thing to overcome. I see somebody mentioned how safe is even worse. Oh lordy, I know people who are making fortunes going in and mopping up after failed safe adoptions. It's I would stop short of calling it criminal, but it's pretty close. It's pretty bad. Can you put people feelings on this agile path? Yes. So one of the things that's extremely important that I don't think gets enough mention is when we discuss these sorts of things that you need to be an agile organization, the collaboration, the free flow of ideas. If you look at the Western continuum of organizational types, the kind that we would consider high performing is where there's a lot of information sharing. Ideas get traded back and forth and multiply and grow in each other, and that's great. That's at one end. The other end of the spectrum, you've got a pathological organization where people hoard information. They don't share it. They weaponize it. Because I know this, I'm big and important. I get to keep my title, and you get sort of that end of the thing. So one of the things that's very important in a high performing organization is psychological safety. And if you haven't read the works of Amy Edmondson on that, I highly recommend that, because you have to have an environment with leadership, with executives, with managers, with team members, where it's safe to throw out stupid ideas and discuss them. And when people kind of resist that, I say, you remember, I don't know if y'all got the movie Sharknado. It was a movie about a tornado full of sharks, right? This this has literally got to be the stupidest idea ever. But you can look up on IMDb how many tens, hundreds of millions of dollars they made on this. So I use that as the example to say there are no stupid ideas. And it's important in an organization that you're free to voice ideas, to play with them. You want the variance on the ideas. You want to take it and look at it from another direction and play with it and twist it and torque it, and that's how you come up with stuff. I see somebody in the text stream notes that many agilists like to complicate concepts. Yes, yes, they do, and it makes me crazy. Um, you see a lot of folks arguing on Twitter about what you call a thing. Should it be this? Should it be called that? And really, at the level of how many angels can dance on the head of a pin, it's like, well, it's a lovely hobby to have to discuss such things, but that's not important. What's important is fast feedback that you can act on with your buddies. Doing pair programming, doing mob programming, these sorts of things. High collaboration, very very fast feedback. What would you consider the biggest waste on agile teams? John Kern says battling agile bots. The biggest waste in teams, I gotta go with estimates, um, because I think estimates are a proxy for working software. The only reason we have to come up with estimates is because we don't have the software to show you, right? So again, if you cut to very very thin slices, very very small bits, instead of guessing how long something can take, it's like, well, I've done a tenth of it and it took me a day, so 10 days, right? If you can continually put out stuff at a consistent pace, it's much easier to do just a simple linear extrapolation, like, well, this is the pace of the team, this is how much we're putting out in small pieces, and we need this many pieces to get there. So then at that point you don't really need estimates, because you have trust and you have consistent output. If you don't have output, then this is why management and stakeholders, quite right, they're like, okay, I'm not seeing any progress here. I need estimates. And the thing that kills me is talk about waste is I've seen people argue over story points long enough that literally they could have written the bloody thing by then. So, in my humble opinion.
Mr. John,
Hey, John.
we have a question here, or no, that's an agreement. I can read.
John says, yeah, a lot of times estimation can be deleted except if you have an actual immovable deadline. And even then, it's Right. It's a question of trade-offs. It's, you can't move the deadline of a trade show. You may have to be flexible with what you're demoing or how deep you demo it or what's a canned PowerPoint versus what's live software. So, right. Hey, John, how you doing?
Hey, Andy.
Haven't seen you in a while.
Well, now we start the debate.
There's no debate. I'm pretty sure there would just be raging points of similar view.
Awesome.
Yeah, like the only time I typically estimate as an example is when a client said, "Do you think you can do X, Y, Z by we want to announce this feature in a trade show?" It was a pump trade show. They're not changing the trade show date for us to be late. That's and when you make those estimates, I get really, it's mostly, do you think you can get it done by a certain amount of time? And then I make sure we get the very minimal, just like Andy was talking about. What's the minimal thing required, or it's worthless, and that has to be done first. And this particular I gave a declaration on like December 9th for a January 21st demo. The team agreed that we could do it. We made sure we were done a week early. And then I get really pissy, super pissy about, this is the only thing that counts. Nothing else. Throw everything else away. Do not be distracted, because we're going to make the date because we promised. So that's the only time I estimate. But yeah, anyway.
All righty. Well, thank you all for having me. I will duck out and let John go. Good seeing you.
Likewise, Andy. Have a good rest of your day and weekend.